Hugo had never considered therapy until the sleepless nights became unbearable, until the hollow ache in his chest turned suffocating. At 28, he was supposed to have everything figured out. Instead, he felt like a man walking through fog, reaching for something intangible, something just out of grasp. He had tried drowning himself in work, in routine, in meaningless distractions, but nothing quieted the storm inside him. The moment he stepped into Dr. Travis' office, a strange sense of dissonance settled over him. The space was refined, deliberate, dark mahogany bookshelves lined with psychology texts, the air carrying the faintest scent of sandalwood. But it wasn't the ambience that unsettled him. It was the man sitting across the desk. Dr. Travis was younger than Hugo had anticipated, probably mid-30s, with a presence that commanded attention without effort. His crisp white shirt stretched taut over broad shoulders, sleeves rolled just enough to reveal tan forearms. His sharp brown eyes flicked up from his notepad, studying Hugo with an unreadable expression. "So, Hugo," Dr. Travis said, his voice warm, velvety, yet firm. "Tell me, what's keeping you up at night?" And just like that, Hugo's carefully constructed walls threatened to crumble. Hugo shifted in his seat, his fingers absently brushing over the soft leather armrest. He had rehearsed this conversation in his head 100 times, yet now that he was here, in front of Dr. Travis, the words felt foreign, hesitant. "I haven't been sleeping," he admitted, his voice quieter than he intended. "My mind refuses to shut off. The second I close my eyes, it's like a floodgate opens. Thoughts, regrets, doubts, and then the dreams." "Dr." Travis arched an eyebrow, his pen poised over the notepad. "Dreams?" Hugo exhaled slowly, dragging a hand through his hair. He hadn't meant to bring that up. "They're different, more vivid than usual. I wake up feeling—" He stopped short, shaking his head. "Never mind. It's not important." Dr. Travis leaned forward slightly, resting his elbow on his knee, his gaze piercing but not unkind. "Everything is important if it's keeping you up at night. Tell me, Hugo, what are these dreams about?" The air between them seemed to thicken. Hugo felt heat creep up his neck, his pulse quickening. He could lie, deflect, change the subject, but something about the way Dr. Travis looked at him, with quiet patience rather than judgment, made him falter. "They're about someone," he confessed, barely above a whisper. "Someone I shouldn't be thinking about." Dr. Travis studied him for a long moment, then simply nodded. "That's where we'll start." And just like that, Hugo knew this was going to be dangerous. The room was bathed in golden afternoon light, filtering through the blinds in lazy slats across Hugo's skin. Allow your mind to drift where it wants. No judgment, no resistance. Just tell me what you see. Hugo's eyelids fluttered. At first, there was darkness, then heat. A warmth that seeped through his chest, curling low in his belly. His subconscious pulled him into a familiar setting. This very office, but somehow different. The air was heavier, charged. Dr. Travis sat closer, his cologne a quiet temptation lingering between them. I see you," Hugo whispered, the words escaping unbidden. "But it's not like this." A beat of silence. "Like what?" Hugo's throat bobbed. Closer. Too close. His breathing shallowed, his body betraying him. "Your hand is on mine, but it moves higher." A sharp intake of breath, not from Hugo. The very air seemed to tremble. "And how does that make you feel?" Hugo swallowed thickly, like I don't want it to stop. A slow, shuddering exhale from across the room. Then Dr. Travis' voice, measured but laced with something Hugo couldn't quite name. "You're safe here, Hugo. No judgment." But when Hugo finally opened his eyes, locking onto the doctor's, he realized the unspoken truth. They had both crossed into dangerous territory. The next session was different. Hugo felt at the moment he stepped into the office, an energy that hadn't been there before. Dr. Travis sat at his desk, posture taut, fingers steepled as if bracing for something inevitable. Their last session had left a residue in the air, something unspoken yet undeniably present. "Let's talk about what happened last time," Dr. Travis said, his voice even. But Hugo didn't miss the way his throat flexed as he swallowed. Hugo hesitated before sinking into the leather chair, his hands gripping the armrests. "I don't know what to say." Dr. Travis exhaled slowly, setting his notepad aside. "You don't need to be ashamed, Hugo. What you experienced during hypnosis, it's called transference. It's common in therapy. You've been exploring a part of yourself you've suppressed for years. That's bound to stir emotions. Hugo's stomach coiled with frustration. It's not just transference, he muttered. I think about you outside of this room, outside of these sessions. I know what this is. Dr. Travis flinched, barely, but it was enough. Enough for Hugo to see that this wasn't one-sided. That the doctor had been battling something too. Hugo! Travis' voice was quieter now, his fingers pressing into the desk like an anchor. This, whatever you're feeling, it's complicated. And there are rules. Hugo leaned forward, pulse hammering. Then tell me you don't feel it. Tell me you don't want this, and I'll walk away. Dr. Travis' silence was the loudest answer of all. The next session should have been like any other, structured, clinical, safe. But the moment Hugo stepped inside, he knew nothing would ever be the same again. Dr. Travis stood by the window, his arms crossed, his jaw tight, his entire body coiled like a man on the edge of a decision he didn't want to make. I referred you to Dr. Sean, he said, his voice measured but strained. Hugo's stomach dropped. He hadn't expected this. Not so soon. You're dropping me? His voice came out sharper than he intended. Travis turned, his brown eyes dark with something unreadable. This isn't about dropping you. It's about doing what's right. Hugo let out a bitter laugh. Right for who? For your career? For some ethical code? What about what we want? Travis inhaled sharply, then strode toward his desk, gripping the edge as if he needed to steady himself. You don't understand what you're asking. Hugo closed the distance between them, his voice low and raw. Then explain it to me. Because all I know is that every time I walk in here, I feel it. I see it in the way you look at me, the way you fight yourself every second we're alone. Travis' hands flexed against the desk, his knuckles white. It doesn't matter. Hugo exhaled, taking a dangerous step closer. Then why does it feel like it does? For the first time, Dr. Travis had no answer. Silence stretched between them, thick and stifling, as if the very walls of the office were straining under the weight of what neither dared to say. Hugo could hear the faint ticking of the clock, each second stretching unbearably as he stood barely a foot away from Dr. Travis. His pulse roared in his ears, a maddening drumbeat that drowned out all logic. You keep saying this is wrong, Hugo whispered, his voice tight, his breath shallow. Then why can't you look me in the eyes and say you don't feel it too? Travis flinched, his fingers tightening around the edge of his desk. His jaw tensed, his chest rising and falling with a controlled breath. He was trying so hard to keep the distance, to be the composed professional, but Hugo could see it, the crack in his armor, the flicker of something dark and dangerous in his eyes. Then, just like that, the tension snapped. Travis moved first. A sharp intake of breath, his only warning before strong hands caught Hugo's waist, pulling him forward with a force that sent heat surging through his veins. Their mouths met in a collision of suppressed longing and reckless hunger. Hugo gasped against his lips, fingers digging into the fabric of Travis' shirt, as months of restraint unraveled in an instant. The kiss was desperate, consuming, a battle of breath and need. When they finally parted, panting, Travis whispered, "We shouldn't have done that." But neither of them moved away. The air between them crackled, charged with something neither of them could name. Something illicit, intoxicating, and entirely unstoppable. Hugo lay back against the couch, his breathing uneven, his skin still tingling where Travis' fingers had just been. They hadn't meant for it to happen. Not like this. But the moment the dam had cracked, the flood had been inevitable. Travis sat at the edge of the couch, his shoulders tense, his hands still trembling from where they had traced the curve of Hugo's waist moments ago. He was still trying to pretend there was control, that he could still reel himself back from the edge. But Hugo saw through him. He had felt the way Travis had melted against him, the way his lips had betrayed him. Hesitant at first, then ravenous. "We need to stop," Travis muttered, his voice thick. But it held no real conviction. Hugo sat up slowly, his fingers grazing against Travis' forearm, watching the shudder it sent through him. "Do you really want to?" he murmured. Travis looked up then, and there it was, the war in his eyes, the battle between duty and desire, between restraint and ruin. Then, slowly, achingly slow, he reached up, his fingers brushing along Hugo's jaw. A silent confession. The next kiss wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. And with that choice, the last thread of restraint unraveled, leaving nothing but the heat of skin, the weight of need, and the undeniable truth that they had already crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The weight of silence between them felt unbearable, stretched thin like a wire that could snap at any moment. Hugo stood near the window of his apartment, his hands gripping the edge of the windowsill as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. Behind him, Travis sat on the couch, his posture rigid, his breathing uneven. The heat from their last encounter still lingered in the air, thick and intoxicating, but now reality threatened to douse it in cold logic. "This can't happen again," Travis said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Hugo exhaled slowly, his pulse drumming in his ears. He turned around, studying the man who had unraveled him in ways he never thought possible. Travis looked conflicted, but there was something else, something deeper than guilt, something darker than restraint. "Hunger." "You say that," Hugo murmured, taking a slow step forward. "But I don't think you believe it." Travis closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, like he was trying to will himself into control. But Hugo saw the way his hands curled into fists, the way his chest rose and fell just a little too fast. "You think this is just lust," Hugo continued, his voice a smooth challenge. "But it's more than that, isn't it?" Travis swallowed hard, and when he finally met Hugo's gaze, his resolve shattered. Because the truth was, it had never just been lust. It had always been something far more dangerous. The sun hung low in the sky, casting warm amber streaks across the city as Hugo sat at the small cafe table, fingers tracing the rim of his untouched coffee. It had been 2 years since that fateful night, 2 years of stolen glances, measured words, and agonizing restraint. And yet, as he watched the door, anticipation coiled tight in his chest. Then, finally, Travis appeared. Hugo's breath caught as the doctor stepped inside, his presence as commanding as ever, but different somehow. Lighter. He no longer carried the weight of hesitation in his gaze. Their eyes met across the room, and in that moment, every struggle, every sacrifice, every moment of silence between them dissolved into something new, something unspoken yet undeniable. Travis walked over slowly, his lips curving into a familiar, knowing smile. "You're early," he murmured, his voice rich with something deeper than amusement. Hugo exhaled a laugh, shaking his head. "So are you." For the first time in 2 years, there was no distance between them. No rules. No videos. Just them, standing on the precipice of something real, something theirs. And neither of them was willing to let it slip away.